you very much, Shrikant. I wanted to comment because before we got started, the discussion you were having with Neville was so interestingly metamodern. Because on the one hand, Neville started off talking about how there had been a criticism of systems and metasystems that, if I can try to put if I can try to put it correctly, you thought had gone too far in the error detection because you saw that there were errors in these systems, but you thought that that didn't justify the elimination of them. And so it seems to me that that's exactly the interplay between the modern age, with the generation of systems, the postmodern age, with the generation of criticism of those systems. And now some people are thinking, well, things aren't going so well. We need to go back to the modernist ones. But I think the real step forward here is the metamodern step, which is to incorporate both the modern systems, acknowledging their flaws, but acknowledging their pragmatic use at the same time. And, refusing not to compromise on those, both extremely important axes of societal well-being. So I thought that was very metamodern. And then Shrikant, you were talking about, what was it? I remember what you were saying. It struck me as so metamodern. Remind me what it was.
This was the Great Books program, where
Yeah.
these people from University of Chicago and Encyclopedia Britannica put together all the philosophers, scientists,
Putting them together.
scholars, all together and trying to say what are they trying to say and try to create a dialogue between them across time and across.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, this strikes me also as extremely metamodern because part of the metamodern meme space, the concept space, one of the ideas here is that our maps of reality, our concepts, we judge them on the basis of how accurate they are, and we judge them on the basis of how successful they are at allowing us to navigate our environments. But what we sometimes fail to keep in mind is that they are not actually concepts. They are physiological phenomena that our organism instantiates, in the brain or the nervous system or somewhere in the body. Any concept we think of is ultimately a shape that the organism takes. And so we have to learn to take on all kinds of shapes, perspectives we don't believe are true, and see through their eyes and allow our organism to take on those shapes and to accept being in those shapes, to give love and blood flow and integration to those shapes. This is a sort of psychological, physical, example of how a metamodern principle can operate. But then we see that fractally, the same principle operates at the interpersonal level or at the intergroup level in the synthesis of the many ideas of the scientists and the philosophers and so on, and discovering that partly what we're doing is we're putting their insights together, but partly it's that we're using them as inspiration to derive new insights altogether. And you might naively suppose that, well, if the ultimate truth is not composed out of any of these systems' claims, then why would they be of any use in coming to the truth, or the best possible approximation of it? But somehow I think that's the right way. I think that there's genuine excellence and genius that's been put into these systems. And if we really put them together, we can catch something of the music, the rhyme and the reason across these human productions and culture, and somehow derive from that, a system that's more effective than any so far. Which on the one hand sounds crazy. It's like, what, the best system ever? And on the other hand, it's like, well, did we not have the best system ever over and over and over and over again throughout history? Things just got better and better in a lot of ways for a long time. And that came into the modern age, where for a brief sort of period that felt like a golden age, we felt like it was all upward from here. Different systems had their theories about how it was going to happen, but they were sort of like, everything's been getting better. Especially recently, things have just been getting explosively better. And then came the postmodern age, And we critiqued all of the systems that created that time of surplus and plenty. And we found that our venerated institutions were riddled with flaws, and that if we took out everything that was flawed, what was left over was nothing. It was all flawed, all the way down. This is a little bit reminiscent of the Buddhist paradigm that says something like, your narratives about your life, the existence of a self across time, they are all delusional. And I would say they all have some aspect of delusion, because you're only approximating an understanding of reality. But just because something has some delusion as part of it doesn't mean that it's nothing but delusion. And likewise, the postmodern deconstruction of our collective ego, of all of our institutions, our modernist systems and metasystems, it's been critiqued to nothingness on the justification that there are flaws in every part of it. And part of the problem is that all of those critiques are like right, not all of them, but like, yeah, it's true that there's like basically a flaw in anything you might care to look at. That's brought us this far in the world so far. But the metamodern approach here, that's on the one hand, it's the synthesis of the insights across many systems like Shrikant was talking about. And it's partially the movement between the metasystems and the critique of the metasystems that Neville was talking about. The metamodern idea here is something like, just because there's some delusion in every piece of it doesn't mean it's nothing but delusion. Just because there's some flaw in every institution doesn't mean it's nothing but flaws. And so instead of continuing on the current trajectory of postmodernism, I like to think we're in the late postmodern age, or maybe even the early metamodern age. Maybe it's already happened. Because if we keep going deeper and deeper into late postmodernism, I think it's just going to get emptier and emptier of reliable meaning-making structures that people agree on a large basis. Like everybody's going to have their own conclusion about what's going on or whatever, but it's going to dissolve into like a million different perspectives, which can be powerful on the one hand, but it can be a disaster. It can be very chaotic. There's going to be so little that we agree on. I mean, if we keep going deeper into the late postmodern age and we lose the meaning structures that we use to coordinate, to share perspectives in common, and use them to come to solutions to novel problems that crop up. If we're going to be able to perform our essential human function as an information processing, solution generating species and solve the problems that are currently facing us, then I think we need to rapidly switch over to the metamodern age and stop deconstructing things because they're flawed and instead accept that there's never going to be a flawless system. If you're waiting to love it until it's flawless, then you're just never, ever gonna love it. So you just have to start day one with the premise that it's going to be flawed and justifiably critiquable, and if you want, unlovable. And you have to just assume that's going to be it the whole way down. And then you have to make a choice. Like, are we going to critique it because we can justify that critique? Even though that means continuing deeper into the emptiness of the late postmodern age and perhaps off a cliff? Or do you choose to love it because that would actually work better? That if we were to love all the institutions, knowing in advance they were going to be flawed, and each other and ourselves, this is one of the fractal principles of the metamodern idea. The same principle that we use to navigate psyche frictions in my own body and my own mind, you can also use to address interpersonal conflicts and intergroup conflicts and ultimately global conflicts. It's the same basic principles of love and wisdom, this oscillation between the generation of metasystems and things that create meaning that we can believe in, even if we don't believe we'll always believe in them. But we can believe in them for the time being to coordinate and to direct our collective attention more and more toward the metacrisis as a species, as a civilization. And metamodernism, in some sense, aspires to be the solution to the metacrisis. And the metacrisis is the growing list of crises that seem to be looming closer and closer. And people have different theories about which one like hits first. Some people are worried about climate change, or some people are worried about nuclear war or AI or civilizational collapse. There's just so many crises, energy crises, and etc., war. And the metacrisis is the acknowledgement that we don't need, and maybe need not to, pay so much attention to the individual crises right now, and just compress that whole stack down into the metacrisis, round it off to the nearest 10. Because our skill level as a species right now is causing crises faster than we solve them. So even if we just try to work on one of the top 10 crises around the globe and try to go one by one, by the time we solve one, like 2 more will probably have propped up or gotten worse. Like, we cause problems faster than we solve them. And so we need to address that first before, moving on to address individual crises. And once we've addressed our lack of integration of our cultural wisdom, our inability to just take our resources as a species and point them at our problems as a species, like that very basic level of inner coordination. Like, to get to that level, we need this paradigm shift in culture that metamodernism aspires to be, by integrating the best of modernism and postmodernism, the generation of ideas and the critique, a sort of radical love and an uncompromising wisdom. Poetically, I like to say it's something like a love that loves the light and the dark, and a wisdom that chooses the light over the dark. And I also like to say that darkness is for playing with, and light and goodness is for taking seriously. That a lot of our darkness comes out in the world where it really matters and affects each other, And it would be better if, those dark impulses could be just played with somewhere in like some civilizationally safe corner. And then when it came time to like work with the real world, when that like really affected people's lives, we could like put that aside and choose the light over the dark. And so do something like accept the light and the dark within ourselves with love, but then strategically strengthen the light's efficacy in the world, and strategically make the expression of the darkness more and more playful, more and more, like not having a lot of rippling effects that ripple through society and make things worse in the long term. Just adding a little color along the way. This is part of the metamodern aesthetic. The postmodern aesthetic has been this minimalism thing, this black and white, this sort of, if you can't justify having the thing, then get rid of it, because who knows, it might have a flaw, and flaws must be eliminated. And you get down to nothing and nothing, 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 pure blank, white, black. But then the metamodern perspective, instead of being minimalist, is maximalist. It's like, no, everything, everything that we ignored because we could see it had a flaw, like, come back into the light and let us look you over again with eyes that appreciate that you might have something worth contributing to the human dialectic, to the human conversation, even if, we're pretty sure we can see some flaws in your system. Like, this is what happened during the new atheist debates 10, 20 years ago, is they went from religion to religion, and they were like, okay, we can disprove this one with this argument, we can disprove that one with that argument. We just want to be as efficient as possible, disprove them all to help everybody realize that the rational way is, not to believe in God and instead to be science, material atheists. And they sort of reasoned with this presupposition that because they could disprove the ultimate, like final, eternal truth of each religion, according to them, that meant you didn't really need to investigate the religion anymore. There was nothing lovable left over when it had supposedly been disproven as factually true and accurate. But part of the metamodern idea is to gather all the insights from all the cultural products and traditions of our global culture. We've got interconnection on the internet. We've got people talking to each other in a way like never before. There's a certain sense in which the human dialectic became like self-aware. That's the headline for the event, right? The human dialectic, the human conversation sort of became self-aware basically during COVID, because of COVID even. Because we all around the whole planet went inside at the same time and directed our attention to the same object at the same time and talked about it in the same online shared space at the same time on the same most popular social media platforms globally. And so we really started to talk to each other like layperson to layperson, and not just like the ambassador to France talks to the ambassador of Zimbabwe. Now it's the citizens talking directly to each other. And we saw a new integration at the global level of the human culture and conversation, because like during the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw people like in Australia joining in. And it's like, wait, isn't this an American thing? What are the Australians doing? What does it have to do with them? And, in other countries, there were protests, and there were other examples that escape me right now. But during the pandemic, other things came up, and there were global protests instead of national protests or state protests or city protests. Like, the signal alarms of our culture began to propagate across the whole human superorganism instead of staying localized to like the individual nation. And that happened because we were using the internet for our signals instead of our traditional media to some significant degree. And so ever since COVID, we've been awake to each other's presence in this new sort of bottom-up way. And we're like dealing with the aftermath of that right now. In some sense, this was an inevitable step in the dialectic. Like, at some point, the human superorganism was going to integrate at a global layer in a way that allowed for this kind of cross-national, bottom-up coordination and shared perspective. And I've just been playing with the idea of calling this group the meta-nation, on the theory that the meta-nation consists of the growing number of people around the world who are watching the metacrisis, either in the form of watching many different crises scene by scene and getting like maybe overwhelmed by all of it, or compressing all that down to just the metacrisis and directing the attention to how do we become more capable of, just generally more capable of solving crises faster than we generate them. And so when people look at the metacrisis, all the crises, or the concept of the metacrisis, they suddenly notice that they are surely looking at this object shoulder to shoulder with who knows how many other people around the planet. Like, just as soon as you look at it, you realize, oh, of course, somebody else has been looking at this, and I only just now noticed it. But like, once you notice it, like, oh yeah, we're all going to be paying attention to that very soon. And how many other people have already been thinking about this, and what have they been saying about it? And can I get caught up on the cultural conversation? Because surely this is where we need to be directing some of our attention if we're going to somehow enact some kind of cultural paradigm shift and outstrip our cultural incompetence and become capable of solving crises faster than we generate them. And I like to think that we don't just get a return to normalcy, but in our enthusiasm as we level up as a civilization and as a species, we whip past normalcy and slingshot into something even better now that we've learned to solve so many new problems through cultural and dialectical integration. So I keep talking about the dialectic, and I want to be clear that what I'm talking about here is something like the whole human conversation, all of it put together. Like each of us is an information processing system or person, agent or something. But we process information and we come up with ideas. You know, our body senses things in the environment, our nervous system interprets it, our consciousness makes like meaning of it, and we speak what it means to us into the cultural conversation. And if the idea is insightful, it'll tend to catch and spread. It's a meme that catches on because the culture is ready to receive it, and the culture has already like half birthed it anyway. And so you're just giving it the last little bump. And this is maybe why things happen like when those two like geniuses, Newton and the other one, discovered calculus at like the same time
Leibniz.
almost. Yeah,
Leibniz.
yeah. Who's that?
Leibniz.
Leibniz. Great. Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's like maybe that insight was just ripe, ready to be plucked. And if one of them hadn't done it, the other would. And in fact, they both did. And if neither of them had done it, some third other person would have. And so the dialectic progresses incrementally, and even our geniuses, in some sense, are only contributing incrementally. They're seeing a little bit further ahead than most people. But in theory, if they weren't around, somebody else would get there anyway, eventually. There's something inevitable about the dialectic, in that there's something inevitable about the truth. And as we get better at trying to figure out the answers to our scientific and our philosophical and our cultural questions, we're going to find, I don't know, whatever we're going to find. But I guess what I'm trying to articulate is, in some sense, I think the answer is mostly inevitable. And the real question here is how fast we're going to go from here to there, and not whether we're going to go from point A to point B. If we're on some kind of timer because of the metacrisis, the question is, can we advance the dialectic conversation far enough to generate the solutions we need to avert that crisis in time to avert it? Or will the answers be there waiting for us, but we'll churn through the dialectic process too slowly to reach them in time, and that'll be too bad. And so the real idea here is postmodernism has really put the brakes on the dialectic, because it's like detected errors everywhere it can detect errors, and then halted the conversation and arrested the dialectic anywhere there are errors. It's like, okay, before we proceed, figure this out. And you're like, I think we need to go. And they're like, before we proceed, let's figure this out. And you're like, we can't stay here forever. And they're like, that's fine, but like, just real quick, let's figure this out before we proceed. And like, they will never let go of that. That's the postmodern sort of perspective. But the metamodern perspective says, it doesn't matter if we make mistakes along the way. We already know we're going to make mistakes along the way. The only question is if they're going to be big or small. And maybe if they're going to be mistaken either way, the distinction between big and small doesn't matter that much. And maybe what really matters is speed through the dialectic, all the cultural insights, all the resources that contribute to that process brought together in a well-designed sort of machine for advancing the dialectic. Whereas it has so far advanced in a blind, sort of stumbling uphill way, will just open its eyes and look at the most important problems to address and the most promising sort of opportunities to invest in, and we'll just devote humanity's resources to those. And I don't know if it'll be enough to solve the crisis even then, but like it's at least a far better attempt as a species than we're going to do if we handle it as well as we handled COVID. Like to some degree, even if we came up with some brilliant plan about how if everybody did it just right, we could handle like the most amazing crisis. And it's like, right. Like you lost me at everybody handling it just right. It doesn't even matter if you have the answer. If there's not sufficient coordination in our species to enact the plan. And so we need to turn the attention to that direction, increasing societal coordination globally. And that's the dialectic. We want the information processing of every person to be funneling their insights, contributing into the dialectic. We want the dialectic to advance quickly, and we want people to be able to come to rely on being met somewhere halfway down the road. Like imagine it's a Hollywood movie where the plot is something like all the answers you need to defeat the aliens are here on the planet somewhere, but you have to put them together in time, like to be able to repel the aliens. And like the whole species like tries to find the pieces, and they find the scientists and the whatever, and they put them together, and it's a beautiful story of the human dialectic, microscoping in on a microscopic target and hitting it with excellence. And that is not how we handled COVID. If you had written the story of how we handled COVID, nobody would have believed that's how we would have handled COVID. So I think our species-wide cultural intelligence is wasting a lot of processing power on trying to generate the solutions we need right now. When the truth is, we are not in a good position to even imagine that we're going to get the right answer. We're not one step away from the right answer. We have no idea how many steps it is down the road, but we don't look like we're about to get it all right. So instead of trying to be like this genius who, even though like it's 1,000-mile shot, you're like, well, maybe if I'm smart enough, I'll hit the target, even though every genius forever has tried to hit it. It's like, yeah, maybe you will. But wouldn't it be more productive to just coordinate on marching towards the target? And then at some point, it's only a 100-mile shot, you know, and then some genius can hit it, and that's great. But we stand on the shoulders of giants. Our geniuses stand on the shoulders of giants. And if none of our geniuses, not our scientific geniuses, not our political geniuses, not our religious geniuses, none of our enlightened geniuses, none of our geniuses artistically or of any kind appear to be on the cusp of figuring this out and helping us get our act together. So we're probably we're not in spitting distance of the target. That's the problem. And that means we need to redirect our attention away from trying to generate the answer per se right now, and instead direct it toward just general advancement through the dialectic. Just take all the cultural insights, the juicy dialogues that never were between like the religions that never talked because they had too much faith in themselves and sort of rejected what was in the other. But we can have those conversations now. There's a certain dialogical openness. We're willing to learn from each other. And if we put all the insights from Buddhism together with all the insights from Christianity and Hinduism and Islam and Judaism and so forth, and we say, stop trying to look for the errors that prove either or one of you wrong or yourselves right. Look for all of the ways to combine your fun thoughts and your beautiful thoughts and your brilliant ideas to generate new ideas. And we'll just get whatever those ideas are. They're the ones that have been waiting for us if only these dialogues would happen. and they've just never really happened because they don't make themselves happen. They wait for the dialectic to become self-aware and then make them happen by reasoning about how to advance the dialectic rather than relying on it to happen subconsciously. So this is the idea of the human dialectic becoming self-aware. Like the human dialectic has been operating for the whole of human history. Culture's been talking, and the caveman and the ice age and the cities and the modern day. And the whole conversation operated without anybody noticing it operating until, and I'm just going to talk mythologically here. Metamodernism is very comfortable with this sort of speaking. I'm speaking mythologically. And that means I'm just going to try and get the point across. Don't hold me to this historical analysis here. But let's just say nobody knew what the dialectic was consciously until Hegel. Like Hegel was the first philosopher to be like, oh, look, there's this human conversation that generates the, I know, that's not, I said mythologically, didn't I? Neville will teach us the correct details at the end. but just say, oh, Hegel was the first one. Oh, look, it's the dialectic. In that moment, some little piece of the dialectic, one human cell in the dialectic, was conscious of the dialectic for the first time. It wasn't really Hegel, that's fine, but it was somebody somewhere that for the first time, the tiniest point within the dialectic was self-aware and knew itself and gave itself a name through mythological Hegel. And then he spread the idea, right? He talked about it to others. And today, you know, there are thousands and thousands of people who appreciate this idea of the whole human conversation that processes information and generates insights and therefore generates solutions, including the solutions we're going to need if we're going to get our civilization aimed at the metacrisis. And so at this point, the dialectic is a little self-aware in the thousands and thousands of human beings that know there's a dialectic and think about it sometimes. But the dialectic isn't, it is, but it's too slow. We need to advance it. And metamodernism gives us the lenses we need to potentially advance it extremely quickly, because it's the same move up dimensions of the hierarchy, so to speak. And so we can iterate on the move. But what I'm getting at first is this idea that because some section of the population is aware of the dialectic can use those people to look at itself and become self-aware, very much in the same way that a person, you know, looks at themselves and becomes self-aware and has certain powers that come with being conscious that would be missing without that consciousness. And when the human superorganism, the human information processing system, becomes self-aware, first through Hegel, then through us and thousands of others, we have the ability to say, how can we make that dialectic operate more rapidly, systematically, efficiently? And the dialectic generates a plan. Oh, this is what we'll do, this is what we'll do. And then we'll try the plan and like it'll half fail or half succeed or whatever. And we'll observe that failure. We of the dialectic seer people will observe the failures of our first attempt, and then we'll incorporate what we learned and generate plan 2.0, which will be better suited to the environment, more sophisticated. And we'll try it again and fail again, and then make a new plan again. And we'll just keep updating the plan. And the point is, we don't need a good plan 1.0. We don't need a good plan 2.0. We don't need to plan how to make a good plan. We just need to go as fast as possible towards any plan 1.0 and then hook it up into that feedback cycle of bouncing it off reality, seeing its failures, redesigning plan 2.0, putting it out and iterating on that process. And thus the dialectic designs itself iteratively, meta, recursively, and then however good the plan 10.0 is, that's like the most perceptive eye ever created by the human cultural dialectic. It's like the most powerful grip ever created by our civilization. You know, plan 10.0 is the best tool ever created for reaching back on the dialectic once again and tweaking things to try and make it advance more quickly and to get it out of the rut that postmodernism has stuck it in, and reinvigorate the societies that feel like nothing matters. You can't do anything. You can't say anything. It's just a nothingness epidemic. We reinvigorate it with the radical love of the acceptance, the maximalism of all the beauty in all the systems and all the beauty in all of the shadows of those systems. Just a radical universal love that even loves judgment and even loves rejection and even loves fighting when necessary. A truly radical love that does not back down in the name of love, but understands that really radical love accepts aggression, because it loves aggression. It loves everything. And, you can love an enemy and still oppose them if necessary. But if you love them, you'll understand them better, and you can negotiate peace with them much more reliably. And even if you do have to fight them, loving them will actually make you more effective at that as well. So in the end, the radical love that is more powerful is this one that has certain things that may seem distasteful to us, really loving the perspectives of enemies. We say, hate the sin, love the sinner. And we suppose this to be a message of love and forgiveness, when it literally starts with telling you to hate. I mean, that's twisted. I would say something like radically love the sin and the sinner, and then love the uncompromising wisdom to judge between light and dark, and keep the sin for play, and indulge the darkness where it doesn't get out into the world and ruin things too much. And take building a better world seriously, and use the self-awareness the dialectic has now to point back on itself iteratively, over and over again, and rapidly bring new layers of coordination to the human superorganism. Like the tiniest hint of that is those protests happening globally instead of nationally. We start to coordinate globally. And if we can start to do that more and more effectively, we can churn through the dialectic, find the solutions that might take us 20 years to find, or might take us 5 if we go fast enough. And that might be fast enough. And 20 might be too slow. So we can churn through the dialectic, find the solutions we need to really awaken as a superorganism, as a species, and simply achieve the basic level of competence and success. Direct our resources at our problems. And I don't know if that'll work, but it's obviously the first step toward doing what may work, and is therefore our best and only chance, as far as I can tell. So that is the idea of metamodernism making the dialectic self-aware. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Hunter. All right, folks, would love to have people comment. Let's keep the initial things focused on questions. We can ask brief questions and then let Hunter kind of explicate what are the big questions on your mind. Go ahead. Let's just focus on questions initially, and let's try to be very brief. Instead of presenting an alternative view, we will have opportunity of doing that. But let's start with questions. Okay, give me just a second here. Let me set things up right here. Okay, we're going to start with Neville, followed by Chris. Neville.
Okay, to go to an exact question, which is my question at 0.5, following from your point at 0.6, you said, and I really agree with you. I'm quite excited. Thank you very much. I think.
Can you handle? I need to take a call. Can you?
All right. Why? I just wanted to point out the 0.6, which illuminates the question. The question is, why set critique against love and love against critique? That's the question.
I guess I would say that love does not appreciate the critical perspective of wisdom in some sense. Love looks at the light and the darkness and loves them both, at least the radical sort of love I'm talking about. But if you have only that love and you have no discriminating sort of light to divide between the light and dark, then you just have this undifferentiated embrace of the light and the darkness. And it's like not necessarily horrible in the sense that, well, if you love it all, like even if bad things are happening, well, you love it all happening, so maybe that's okay. But it doesn't lend itself to strong foundations for civilizations to grow on. And so the introduction of wisdom to discriminate between the light and the dark is important. And at the same time, because the wisdom has this necessary role of judging between the good and the bad and instantiating that in civilizational systems, it so easily falls into the trap of assuming that the darkness is bad and not to be loved because it needs not to be empowered. And, those are two different things. And so what wisdom needs to learn from love is that even the darkness has its place, has its proper role, and is integrated into the whole and appreciated for whatever it can do. And love needs to learn from wisdom that just because you love the light and the dark doesn't mean that you put the darkness on the throne. You put it wherever it's safest to keep it, even if you play with it, and you make sure that you take seriously building like goodness and good structures and wholesomeness into society. And so that's why I think that love and critique or love and wisdom need to sort of balance each other in this way. All right, Chris, next.
Yeah, great topic and great presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about the scope of dialectics, because this reminded me very much about cultural evolution, where you
Yeah.
say about the kind of intellectual and physical tool that the society has determined kind of what makes them different from each other and how. So would you include like physical dialectics, like the clashes of civilizations and tools,
Yeah.
or purely conceptual dialectics we're talking about?
No, certainly both. I mean, it's ultimately just whatever is after the selecting mechanisms have done their work, and whatever's around somehow made it there. And so if it made it there culturally, physically, however, it's got some amount of staying power, either to propagate itself or to be stable across time like a rock. All right, Robert.
Yes, for the concept that we're talking about tonight, dialectics, who would you say are the thought leaders in this area? You're looking at me like you're confused. Like if we were talking about health and germs, it would be Louis Pasteur who discovered germs, right? So I'm asking you, if you were going to write a paper about this, and in the beginning you were going to say there were three people who are the fundamental thought leaders of this, who are they and what are their most important contributions?
I don't know. All right, Paul.
I want to build maybe on the question behind Robert's question, maybe not. First of all, thanks
Yeah.
for the presentation, Hunter.
Thank
And
you.
even trying to think about this is valuable. So anything you would say
Right.
would be valuable. So in a way, but I start to get into the question as I try to follow where you're going and hit various blocks. The question that comes up for me that I'd be curious to hear you talk about is this judgment of the good and bad And doesn't that have a set of values behind it that may make that a whole problem in itself? That you decide what lives in the light, the wisdom, the discrimination, to do that in a global, single-minded way. How do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the reasons I say things like metamodernism is not the answer or claiming to have the answer. It's more like the right question or the path to getting to the right answer. Because I mean, yeah, exactly. What on earth is the right answer to that? I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure that if we were able to ever figure it out, we would do it by processing information and talking with each other. And we'd have fruitful dialogues and new insights. And somewhere down the road, maybe 100 insights down the road, maybe 1,000 or 1,000,000, but somewhere down the road, somebody smarter than me or you or anybody who lives right now will be able to take a decent crack at answering that question.
Or a decent crack at getting consensus of these thought leaders. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Judy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hunter. This is very interesting and thoughtful. And I wanted to answer this question of who are the thought leaders.
Oh, yes, please.
I think we are all thought leaders, all the group that's here, to start with. And so this can generate into more thought leaders, or we start talking about it with other people. Because if we're going to introduce it into like a curriculum or whatever, or put it in books so that people could read them. Okay, so when is that going to happen? And not fast enough, because all the crises are upon us. So we just have to learn how to generate these thoughts and all become leaders of this generation. It kind of reminds me of, in training, I'm a trainer by profession, something called systems approach to training. That's an open loop. It never closes. So you analyze, and then you design, and then you develop, and then you implement, and then you evaluate. But along the way, if you find something that is not working right, or because you're getting constantly feedback, then you have to maybe go back to the design or go back to the implementation, or and then again and again and again. It's an open system. It never ends the loop. Versus the closed system, always, okay, we evaluated, this is it, this is how it's going to go. No, we never get there, because we're always processing, and the loop doesn't end. So that's what I wanted to say.
There's something about that shape that reminds me of consciousness, or ideas like "I am a strange loop" from Douglas Hofstadter, who had like computational theories of how consciousness comes out of the brain's deterministic computations. But it's like, it's these recursive systems that have no limit. And somehow it's that iteration ability that seems to be related to what we call free will, in some sense anyway. It's that sense that you can just iterate on like being able to like do different things. And it's probably, I mean, scientifically, maybe it doesn't actually add up to free will, but it's sort of the feeling that free will seems to come from, is when those systems are unbounded. And it's when those systems are closed that people feel like they have no choice but to do whatever the system tells them to do.
Thank you. I'm back. Let's go with Jeannie next. Jeannie. And if I have to step away, I will just let you know, and then you take over the moderating.
All right, sounds good.
Jeannie, go ahead.
Hi, Hunter.
Hey.
We had Patricia Rosario on, and she was sort of admonishing the artists for not doing a better job at leading. But I do think I'm in the visual arts, but certainly video arts, but music especially, I think they have their thumb on the pulse of the culture. And I think I followed music sort of like you would follow news, and you can see it in just, a little touch of this lyric and that lyric and the attitudes and stuff. You could see things happening in music that really, I think, are leading us. And, not enough. But I do think it's a source, and I can't really say who exactly the thought leaders are, but I think music and other arts can be a source for us to carry the ideas into the, general population.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. So I've seen breakdowns of the dialectic that try to arrange themselves in order from like most primordial and basic to like most sophisticated, that like, human beings gained the ability to do and not our ape relatives. And it would put things like imitation as very basic, and then somewhere it would get to ritual, and then to drama and plays and movies, and then down to like literature, and then to more abstract analyses, and then to like mathematical rigor or something like that. And so these are sort of the rungs of the ladder of the dialectic in some sense. It's like before we get to a new math idea, it often seems like it has to sort of be in the mimetic waters, almost ready to be discovered. And so our geniuses discover what is available to be discovered based on where our culture is pointing them to investigate. And so the imitation that leads to ritual, that leads to drama, that leads to literature, that leads to abstract knowledge, every part in this process has an important role to play in processing information from one level of resolution to a more compressed, distilled level of understanding and knowledge. And as you run through that process, you distill more and more and more information down to a more and more and more distilled essence. And then we teach that to our children. We teach them to read, and we teach them math, and we teach them our cultural innovations and products. And they become, more capable than us of investigating the dialectic and new ideas and generating solutions. So we make ourselves stronger generation by generation by using the dialectic to generate the insights that strengthen our children and therefore ourselves as we become a more competent species. And so the meta-modern take on this dialectic understanding is find the meta-modern version of every part of this ladder, the meta-modern version of ritual, the meta-modern version of drama, the meta-modern version of literature, and etc. And I won't go into the details of each of these, but just speaking in broad terms, the idea of the meta-modern version of these is a version of drama or literature or movies or whatever that acknowledges that it plays a genuine role in humanity's ability to solve its problems, potentially a serious role, even if we think of it as more about amusement or fun, but a serious role to play in processing information and contributing insights to the dialectic and speeding us forward. And so reflect on that role, dramatists and writers and musicians and so on, and ritualists, and think, how could I potentially devote my art to the metacrisis? How could I devote my art to humanity directing its attention to the metacrisis and directing its resources to the metacrisis? And how can I push the dialectic forward as fast as possible? And if we all sort of push in that direction together, we just have a really inventive sort of renaissance, sort of a time in culture. And we got all kinds of crazy new ideas. And somewhere in the midst of that, hopefully we see something that seems impossible to find right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Hunter. I think Colin has not spoken before. So Colin followed by Neville. Colin.
Okay, well, this is kind of a new topic to me, so
Okay,
forgive me for my ignorance. Yeah.
Sure.
Hunter, just take over moderating. I'll be back.
Okay.
Okay. But you said take out everything that's flawed and nothing is left. And I thought that was kind of an interesting thought experiment. It kind of put my mind in a simulation of maximum entropy, just what's left. And it brought me back to Plato, the first principles, the forms. And it was just a good meditation for me. And I thought, why don't we teach these kind of ideas to our kids? I mean, Plato was talking about the forms, 2,500 years ago or something like that. And the other thing that I thought of while you were describing just generally, I kept coming back to the phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
We obviously are not in contact with the first principles, the forms. We don't understand what the beautiful, the good, the just, those kind of things are in their true essence distilled down. But I do think we can all understand that phrase of, you know, just working towards the good, even if it's not perfect. So that was my thoughts.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you. Yeah, like I think part of the metamodern approach to the dialectic, like we're in the dialectic right now. You know, like I've shown up here, I've talked about ideas that I've been trying to think through. Partially, I'm hoping, you know, to get feedback from everybody in like a sounding board, and to like you channel that to further the dialectic even more. And part of the metamodern approach to speeding through this process, I think, is to embrace that you're going to make mistakes. And so stop spending so much of your energy on trying to make as few mistakes as possible. And instead, just try to get to the better version, the more processed version of yourself and of societal ideas and so forth that you could be if you devoted your efforts in that direction, you know, full speed ahead, even though you would make lots of mistakes along the way.
Thank you. All right, next up is going to be Mona, followed by Neville. We're going to go with new people first, and then you can continue. Mona, go ahead.
Thank you, Hunter, for the presentation. I've got to say, it impressed on me because I'm a mathematician, and I also know lots of engineers. And I know the way people think in terms of, you know, like in mathematics, we're concerned with solving problems by finding the truth, whereas in engineering, people want to just build things and make it work. And then I could see that there's value to both. And I can certainly appreciate that we need things to work, and whatever we build is going to collapse anyway. So we shouldn't wait until we have the perfect construction, right? I understand that. And I understand how that can slow things down. But if you're totally focused on perfectionism, but I have a lot of questions about, like, when you say put everything in on the table and don't worry, just embrace it all. Like, where do things like the gravest tragedies in history belong? Like, like say, let's talk about Holocaust. Like, should we embrace that as a mistake, or
well, yes, the easy part.
should we accept that it could happen anytime? I mean, I don't know.
Well, probably we should accept that it could happen. I mean, that's sort of the idea of the whole never forget idea, is that if you forget about it and treat it like it could never happen, well, then it might happen. But if you treat it constantly like it's something you're trying to avoid, that's theoretically supposed to be the safe solution. But then part of the metamodern dialectical analysis would be to say, hey, what's the shadow of that? What's the cost of constantly directing your attention at that specific flavor of hell and trying to get away from it? But the easy part to say is that, well, wisdom would just discriminate, bam, darkness, bad, Holocaust, defeat the Holocaust, overthrow the Holocaust. The tricky part is to say, well, does love somehow love the Holocaust even though it also rejects it? Does it somehow try to find any iota of light in it? Try to think of a way it could have been even worse, if that were possible, and then be like, well, you know, there is some possible even worse darkness, that somehow out of all of that horror, all of the people's decisions, so many of them bad, somehow they added up to there was a moment when one extra bad thing could have happened, And somehow out of all the pieces, it added up to the person not doing that. And we say, hey, that's nice. Like, glad that happened.
Thank you.
And it's not much, but you try, I guess. I don't know.
Thanks, Hunter. Next up is going to be Neville, followed by Paul. Neville.
Okay, Paul's gone ahead. I didn't know whether Paul spoke before.
I think Paul spoke before, so go ahead.
So, Hunter, follow on from Colin's question about Plato's form. And I think the problem, I look, there's a lot of good. I mean, and in what you're saying about, and I actually support the basic concept of metamodernism. But I think you've missed Kant, and it's Kant that redesigned Plato's forms. And in missing Kant, what you have is a dialectic gap between epistemology and ontology. To demonstrate that, I'll pick up point 03 in your presentation, and I think you made it as a quib, to a sort of passing comment, but this demonstrates the fact that you need to read Kant.
Okay.
And pick up the dialectic gap, because what
was the thing I said?
What you're trying to do. It's opposite of what you're trying to do. So you actually sort of said not concepts, but the physical phenomena. And you sort of tried to create a gap between the epistemological approach of concepts, ontological approach of physical phenomena.
That's interesting. I don't remember the exact context in which I said that, because right now I would say that I very much believe in both appreciating that our concepts are inevitably partially flawed, and on the other hand, they're not nothing but flaws, and there are genuinely more and less effective concepts for using to navigate the world. And I want the best ones for helping our societies and our culture, direct attention and resources to problems and solve those problems and implement them.
Yes, and I agree. But I think it's when you talk about the cell, and you're talking about the cell, what you may be inadvertently unaware is you've absorbed a whole lot of process philosophy. And when you talk about the cell, that's process philosophy.
I see. Are you saying that I've overemphasized the bottom-up element of the integration, when, of course, if it's true integration, it's a bottom-up being met by a top-down?
I'm saying, yes, that there's a gap in your presentation, which has done the very opposite of what your message is in terms of the dialogue. So you've got to say both and.
Both and, yes. Well, that's I do believe in the both and principle. I think it was McGilchrist who said something like, we want a sort of both and thinking that's both and about both and either or thinking, not a kind of either or thinking that's both and about, that's either or about both and thinking, but not about either or thinking, something like that.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Paul, followed by Chris. Paul.
Oh, that's a great, who's on first thing. I got to do a whole.
Yeah. I still got to work out the kinks.
Anyway, I seem to have in my role talking about Marshall Linehan in every meetup for 52 Living Ideas. I don't know why, but she stole the term dialectic. But I think that tension between acceptance and change is important to bring up to what you said to Mona. I'll get to that. I'll show how I'm getting to that. But when you talk about love and loving the good and the bad, I don't think, Hunter, that you mean what you said to Mona, but I could be wrong, because I'd like to propose that loving doesn't have to go to behaviors. It's perfectly okay to not love behaviors. You accept that the Holocaust happened. That's radical acceptance because it's in the past. You don't have to love it to go with your metamodern philosophy. You hate the behavior, but you love the person, even though they did it, just as someone eventually makes peace with the prison guard at Auschwitz. Because these are all humans that have the nervous systems that were subject to forces. But the behaviors, if your philosophy assumes that you have to love every behavior, maybe you think that. But I don't think you need to think that. And you can have a whole lot of what you're talking about all work with this dialectic between accepting things, even if you don't love them, wanting to change things, but still there's a basic love of the human entity and soul that is constant. That's my thought.
Great. Yeah, it is tricky. Like, it's not a heresy I utter lightly. It's my best guess right now, but like, if I were to be wrong about something, like that would be one of the top guesses for what it would be. But the way I've thought about it is, last presentation I talked about like 5 specific traits that a winning decision theory or meme might have that would allow it to spiral to success. And big part of it was its ability to make friends of opponents rather than enemies. And I just thought, well, just which is going to be stronger? The version that says, hey, I love you, but when I try to look at the world the way you look at the world, I hate it. Want to be friends? And it's like, is that more effective? Is that a stronger way? Or is it stronger to be able to say, hey man, I looked in, like, I like shared your experience in that moment. And like, I didn't hate being me when I was what you were feeling and being right then. Something like that. And like, that's just sort of saying I was able to love it, because this is a little Buddhist, but like, what is a behavior that isn't a person? There's no behavior somewhere happening that isn't a person doing something or an animal doing something. And the question is, in that moment of the sin, how do you feel about them? And how would you feel about what they were going through if you were on the inside of it? And I think maybe the strongest answer is universal love, but you got to have that discriminating wisdom in there.
Can I respond one quickly to that, Shrikant?
Please.
Yeah. I think actually we're closer than we think, and there's actually a yes and right here, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I'd like to hear about that though at some point.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Great point to bring up. It's like, what is the unit? Is the unit an individual person, or is it an idea? Is it an action? What is the unit with which you are doing these operations? Thank you. Next up is going to be Chris, followed by Robert. Chris.
I wanted to ask if you have any solutions in mind to this main problem of making the dialectics that play out more conscious, rather than historically you mentioned that it's been more subconscious, right? Because I thought Hegel's dialectics isn't that famously a theory of history? You're saying this is how it plays out rather than a theory about reasoning. So what are your solutions for improving it, I guess, is my question, that is different from what we're doing already?
Yeah, I've been meeting with people because I'm very like inviting of collaborators. If anybody would like to collaborate, please get in touch. And like, I don't even need to know in advance what we're going to try and do, but let's like try and put together an initiative that would be worth putting together. And so a couple of the ideas I've been working on with some collaborators is one, a bounty hub, and the other is a discussion between people of different faiths and non-faiths, sort of philosophies. And in that case, we would want it to be in the right sort of metamodern style that would try to maximize the information flow in a mimetically powerful way. And so in my mind, the idea is we go to each religion, let's say the 3 Abrahamic religions and Buddhism and Hinduism, like let's say it's those, and like atheists or something, like those 6. And we're basically like, tell each of us your dystopia story. When you look out in the world today, what are the things your attention is drawn to? What does your tradition and your philosophy or religion have to say about what's wrong with the world? And what is your utopia story? If only everybody would agree to follow the precepts of your system, what is the utopia that would result? And what is the plan that your system has for getting from dystopia to utopia? What is the thing that theoretically we go from here we are right now, and the next step is something, and somewhere down the line we arrive at everybody doing the precepts of your system, and we live in a utopia? What does that pathway look like? And I think when we focus on, and I'm going to call this what matters, and the idea being here that all of these systems have different claims ontologically, metaphysically, narratively about what matters. But there's a type of thing that matters when no system says it matters, when all of the stories say it doesn't matter, and yet it moves those who perceive it. And so I think when we talk about what matters, the dystopia, the pragmatism, the bad world we are living in, and the good world we could live in, we find so much in common across the religions. And we find that we're struggling with the same problems in a big way, and that we're generating some surprisingly similar solutions across very different traditions. And in many cases, we are generating the answers that one tradition has been looking for, and that tradition has been generating the answers we've been looking for. And so when we compare in the right pragmatic, metamodern way, we encourage these people to answer each other's questions and rapidly push forward the dialectic on these traditions that never talk to each other. I won't talk about the Bounty Hub right now. I think that was long enough.
Thank you.
I
Next
think,
up is going to be,
Yes, but
yeah.
I think it was a good solution, that the solution is practical, it's a social solution, it's not a theoretical framework solution. Because obviously, if we want to make ourselves more conscious about it, you're going to have to like start some social movement. So yeah, good answer.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Robert, followed by Neville.
You know, my experience is that I have been trained as a scientist, and when I start working on a field, I first try to define the problem space and to collect the fundamental facts that exist. So if I was going to work on, let's say, I think it was number 7 about errors, I'll just share an example which I'm familiar with, that psychologists from the 1950s on have studied the relationship between personality, situations, and behavior. And there was a very fundamental study about whether after World War II, whether the average person could be influenced to obey, to give pain. And it was a study done by Milgram. And Milgram was able to show that a situation could be so powerful that it would control a person's behavior, and that a person would give pain. I probably would have about 5 to 10 if I was going to look at errors in the psychology field and the computer science field. And I would always start with those and say, who has really made significant contributions for these areas? And that's usually my style.
Thank you. Hunter, would you like to respond?
Yes, please. Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the Milgram experiment. I was very impacted by it I collected sort of takes on it from Cialdini's influence. There's a great Netflix movie called The Experimenter about Milgram. There was a movie called Compliance, which I felt was related to the spirit of it. And there was a very interesting section of a book called Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality from the rationalist movement, in which it had a couple of chapters that touched on Milgram experiment themes. And apparently like 2/3 of people would, if told to do so by an authoritative figure, electrocute a fellow study participant or think they were electrocuting them, like potentially dozens of times. 2/3. And before Milgram ran the experiment, he showed it to a panel of psychologists, and he was like, what do you think? How many people are going to go all the way to the end? And they were like, maybe 2 out of every 300. And he was like, okay, cool. And then it was 2/3. And so I heard the legend was that Milgram wanted to go run this experiment on the Germans to see if they were unusually compliant to authority or something. But he ran it on the Americans first as a control. And then he didn't bother going to Germany. He was just like, oh, we totally might have, could have, would have, under the right circumstances. So as far as, preparing to comment reliably on a philosophical subject, I would say that there's a lot of wisdom in what I would characterize as the postmodern approach, which is carefully avoiding committing errors along the way. The disadvantage of that approach, although it keeps things clean and rigorous, and it's just necessary in math, because even the tiniest flaw makes the whole equation wrong. So in math, you just have to do it that way. But in other areas of thought, it's a really clean style, but it's really slow because you have to stop and make sure there aren't any errors getting in. And I think fast is more important than clean right now, especially because we've so been emphasizing that cleanness in the postmodern spirit. So especially right now, we want to correct in the opposite direction and go with speed rather than like careful error detection.
Thank you. Next up is Neville.
Thank you, Hunter. Yes, I'd like to collaborate with you, Hunter.
Oh, wonderful.
So in terms of the immediate now, I'd like to follow Chris's comments around Hegel and Robert's comments around error theory. And so I'm picking up point 19. Now you were talking about genius, but I've rephrased that as Genesis genius. Usually when people talk about genius, they're trying to go back to some sort of origin thought. And you sort of created a binary in your comments, genius versus, maybe a binary, but maybe an accompaniment. But you were talking about the dialogue that never was. Now, in my collaboration, I'm going to collaborate with you as a historian. I pointed out before you missed Kant, and you've missed the 19th century thought leaders, the Hegelian thought leaders in the 19th century. Because in terms of your ethos of your presentation, you seem to have this historical forgetfulness, which sort of gives this impression that apart from geniuses, that we've never really had this dialogue. And there's been a few inquisitors to you, which has pointed out your historical forgetfulness, that this dialogue is not something new. It has been there, since Hegel and well before Hegel.
Thank you. That was one thing. I want to actually look at a dialogue. Like I really like the idea that point 19 about dialogue that never was. Okay.
Hmm.
And let's actually, in real time right now, try to come up with some such dialogues.
Okay.
I remember yesterday, was it yesterday? No, on Wednesday, somebody showed up with a background of two philosophers, and two figures. And I said, who are these people? So it was Socrates and Confucius. Now, I'm not familiar with Confucius, but let's take Lao Tzu. Okay, so we got Socrates and Lao Tzu. So now we're trying to see the dialogue that never was between these two people. What would you say? What's your first take, Hunter?
Well, if we're going to use two historical characters, then what we're doing is basically a metamodern drama. We're going to think
That's
through
good.
problems, understanding that drama is a serious tool for processing information.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Lao Tzu and
If
Socrates.
you want, I'll get started because I have the advantage of actually thinking about it because it was
Yeah, yeah. I know a
in-
little Socrates. I'll
um,
try my best with Lao Tzu.
yeah. So Lao Tzu starts his work, Tao Te Ching.
Oh, he wrote Tao Te Ching. Okay, I
Yes.
know some Lao Tzu. Yeah.
Yes. With 道可道，非常道；名可名，非常名。What it means is that Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. A name
Yes.
that can be named is not the eternal name. Okay. Now, suppose he was to say that to Socrates. Okay.
Hmm.
What happened? What is the difference between the Chinese mind, especially the Taoist mind, and the Socrates mind? As firstly, Socrates would ask him questions. That's
Right.
what he would do. He
Yeah.
relentlessly ask him questions. So there is implicitly within Socrates tremendous value placed on the ability of arriving at truth through words, through dialogue. Whereas Lao Tzu keeps falling back on your direct connection with reality and the richness of that connection. And he does use words. For somebody who is complaining about words, he uses
Right.
beautiful words, but it's poetic way of doing that. So there's this two different styles, but at the same time, the yearning of Lao Tzu or yearning of Socrates for the ultimate truth is as real as is for Lao Tzu. So there is a lot of commonality. They are both trying to get at the truth in very different ways. So that's my initial comments. Go ahead, Hunter.
Well, let's see. Socrates might say, I might try a couple of different possible openers, but I'll think through them here. So he might say something like, oh, my friend, it seems like you think you know what the Tao is or something. Can you please tell me what the Tao is? Or he might say, okay, it sounds like you're saying that to articulate something is necessarily like ridden with errors. How do you think you know that? So yeah, he might do something like that.
Yes. Let's see. Anybody else wants to get on this? Neville, what do you think what would Socrates say to Lao Tzu, and what would Lao Tzu say to Socrates?
Look, I agree with Hunter, and I agree with yourself. My point is the historical point, which is that you're probably not familiar with the fact how common in the scholarship this dialogue that never was is. So to give you a popular example, I don't know, do you know of Peter Keff's novel in 1982?
No.
So Peter Keff wrote this novel called Between Heaven and Hell. It was a novel. It was a Christian novel, sort of done in the ethos of apologetics. But if it's apologetics, it is in some sense a shift away from apologetics, because what it was a novel about a dialogue between John F. Kennedy C.S. Lewis and Aldous Huxley,
Huh.
because those three historical figures died on the same day, the 22nd of November, 1962.
Oh, wow.
So this is not the only work that sort of has illuminated the dialogue that never was, you know.
Let me go ahead and add something here, Neville. This is one of my favorite books. It's called The Great Conversation. This is one of the chapters, one of the volumes of the great books that I was talking about, Hunter. So this idea here is that actually, if you look at almost all great thinkers, they take in a lot of things. They take in everything before them, and they try their best to take in that and then speak to that. So at this level, and this applies to thinkers in all areas. Like you look at Dante, okay, he's taken in all of the Christian thought, all of the classical Greek and Roman thought, and done a new synthesis of himself, adding something of his own. So you see that in art. You see that in works of all of these folks. There are people and they do it in very different styles. There are very different styles. For example, Aristotle or Aquinas, they will always start their work by doing what is equivalent of literary survey, of saying, look, like when Aristotle is looking at what are the possible constitutions that have been created, they will pull all of that in, and then they will start. Aquinas, when he's commenting on the scriptures, he's saying, what has everybody before me said about this particular scripture, of this particular verse? And then he will add his thought. So there is great tradition of this. And what Mortimer Adler is trying to do is that he's trying to put all of these things side by side, so you can see, and it's really you can see not only individual thoughts, individual systems of thought, but how these systems interacted with one another. And what the result is actually quite beautiful, because it shows you like this entire flow of ideas. You can see different viewpoints or different ideas come into being, flourish, and then die, and then have a rebirth, all of that. So you can kind of trace all of this, and there is interactions between these ideas. So it's really fascinating. What do you think, Hunter?
That's very interesting. I was speaking with a psychologist from New York a couple of days ago that one of my collaborators and we got in touch with, because a third initiative besides the hub and the other one was like trying to make a 4-corner exercise I've developed into something that could potentially help with psychological development. And it so happened he was doing something so metamodern. His project was to take people having mental health problems in the Bronx, where he works with people, and find the stories among them that talked through how some of them had thought about suicide and how they'd come to terms with it. And when people having suicidal ideation read those stories, it seems to help. And so his vision of it is very much a sort of meta-modern spiral, where it's taking advantage of resources that are already there. The stories that would help these people get through their problems are right there among their neighbors and families without them necessarily even knowing about it. And you can go your entire life and never make that handshake happen if you're waiting for it to happen organically out of the dialectics, blind, half shambling uphill sort of strategy. But if you know to look with sort of dialectic awareness, where is there a shadow in the human cultural dialectic conversation so far? Where have we failed to look for insights, either to look at all or to look in comparison with the right other insight to generate the right synthesis? And what this academic talked about psychologist talked about was that suicide and other sensitive subjects are chronically understudied in science because you have to get by the ethics board. And so there are areas of reality, of human experience, that science never properly investigates, not as well as it could if it were trying its hardest, for good reasons. Like, the point isn't that there aren't good reasons, but the point is there's a shadow there. There could be all kinds of things to be learned, but we haven't learned them. And likewise, science tends to focus on things with large data sets, which means it tends to focus on the most common occurrences. But that means that there's a shadow in rare events. If your data point is one guy with a weird talent in the Guinness Book of World Records, or like 3 people who you found across the country who have some weird, who knows, whatever. I mean, I knew a martial arts master whose thing is called Ili Chen, Martial Arts of Awareness. And apparently, like, his medical files are just amazing. Like, obviously, I don't know the details, but he apparently just heals really well in certain ways that would normally be considered not how it works, and like even a little bit outside of the scientific understanding of things. But does that, do the doctors immediately do what you would imagine a society? Wouldn't it make sense? Like, some kung fu master comes in with a weird healing event, and the doctor just does the obvious thing and calls, oh, hey, Dr. Scientist, like, we found somebody with something that science hasn't investigated that's of potential and enormous importance for human understanding. Please, arrange for a study. Like, why doesn't this happen? These people are again, chronically understudied. And so science and other aspects of the dialectic, philosophy, religion, and so forth, we say the dialogues that never were, and some of them have been simulated, and that's wonderful, but some of them haven't. And some of them are dialogues, and some of them are these other types of shadows I'm describing. And the point is, if we analyze the structure of the dialectic, the shadow that arises in response to that shape, then we find the areas that have been least investigated, which are our like best chance for finding really ripe, low-hanging fruit that might make us, more integrated and competent as a species, able to divert our resources to the metacrisis.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Colin. Colin, go ahead.
So I went back to thinking about this conversation with religious leaders, like different groups or religions in dialogue with each other. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about the conclusion of that, and it just made me start thinking, maybe that would just lead to like an average. I don't know if that's, does the average or kind of the middle way or the mean of the virtue, does that push us forward? Something kind of like, it led me to think about like Aristotle, the Buddha, Lao Tzu's talking about, find the path of least resistance like water, and Jung holding the tension of the opposites. I just started imagining it all kind of brings everyone into one path, but in doing so, it sort of chips away those sharp edges, like you were just talking about, the outliers, the case studies that might be interesting. I don't know, does finding that perfect balance reduce novelty in some way that actually could reduce potentials? That's just something that I was thinking about. Thanks.
That's a serious concern. I was just imagining somebody asked what a metamodern flag would look like. And I thought it should probably be black and white and rainbow and fractal. And what that would mean is that everybody could make their own version of it, and they would all be identifiable as the metamodern flag, and they would all be individually designed. And I like this symbolism of that for balancing this unifying and yet this individualizing couple of values that are both important. And I wonder if instead of like bringing everybody into a central sameness, what we instead do is generate what I sometimes call handshakes, something like a harmonious layer that, let's just say, for example's sake, that Christianity is a C note and Buddhism is a D note and Hinduism is an E note. So which is the correct note to harmonize with each of those? Well, it depends on each one. But the point is, you meet them where they are. You don't ask them to give up what they have, but you give them a sort of harmonious layer, which on the other side of it shares a center. So if we have these 5 or 6 religions or philosophies, they each have their own unique like hookup to this thing. And then on the other side of the hookups, they all share the same center, where we say, look, we all share something in common, and we all have differences that we don't try to unify around. And we accept a certain amount of diversity, and we insist upon a certain underlying layer of unity. And that's the very beginning, big picture idea of how we try to balance like unity and diversity in a harmonious way.
Thank you. I want to give the answer to Colin based on our experience here at 52 Living Ideas, because we actually tried to do the same thing with 3 religions. So we picked Tao Te Ching, Hinduism, so three works, Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and Gospel of John.
Okay.
And we ran about 100 meetups each. Like 100 each. So that's 2 hours each, 200 hours. They were very popular. This was during COVID. So we had on an average, maybe 30 to 40 people attending each of them, each from very different backgrounds. You know, they were all different kinds of Taoists, different kinds of Hindus, different kinds of Christians, with different views. You know, some people were not at all familiar with Christianity, and they were all talking to each other. And so what did I learn? What did we learn from all of this? To Colin's points, it was actually, firstly, what we tried to do is that we tried to just commune with each text by itself, because you really need to dive into a text. You need to respect that text, because if you quickly try to connect it to something that you know, you're going to end up with only what you know, because that's the easiest, thing to do. So you have to really kind of dive into each of them. And then slowly patterns start to arise. There are a couple of large patterns. One is that you could see the commonality between all 3. And you also saw the unique way in which each of them approached something which the others did not have. So it is like, imagine like a flower, it's like the core is the same, but the petals are different. And they're very, very different from each other. So together, they're far more powerful. But you need to get the center that is common to them, and then you need to add to the variation that each one of them bring, and then you have something which is that. So that's our experience of those meetups. Colin, I hope this is useful.
Yeah, if I may comment on that.
Please.
I think part of, again, this idea that the winning meme tries to make friends, I think part of what you're describing about giving sort of each differentiated thing even more space to express its unique contribution, I think that's exactly the right attitude for sort of metamodernism, the winning meme, radical love. The idea is part of the reasons we shake hands is because, you haven't been completely open to other perspectives, but I've been willing to be open to them sort of for you. And so I've discovered all these insights that would enhance your practices, enhance your walk with God, or your finding of meaning or peace in life, or whatever it may be. And if you haven't been out there finding them for yourself, I have now packaged them for you in accessible language that, reaches you where you are. And that's why we make a good handshake, is I'm helping you get more of what you want. I'm not asking you to compromise it for me. And so if metamodernism can meet each religion and philosophy where it is, help it get even more of what it's seeking for, instead of asking it to give it up, which has been the attitude so far, then maybe we generate enough like goodwill and dialogue to be able to share one layer in common and accept that the rest is not in common.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Chris, followed by Robert. Chris.
Yeah, so it's a classic problem of like, how much do you let people be heard, and how much do you study what is, and how much do you try to reason towards an optimal kind of synergy moving into the future. And that balance is always really hard to strike. And I think it's, especially at work, like you have a meeting between different colleagues and we're going to decide on how to do something. and people see a different solution. So every discussion, you're just talking about different things because you don't take the time to explore each person's idea because you don't have that time. You have to make a decision and start building something. And so I guess this is the problem historically. Like if we spend hundreds of years studying ancient cultures, aren't we just gonna, because then those are gonna make more sense. So then we kind of make the past, the present zeitgeist, if you like, rather than try to envision the future and leave the past behind. Like which, on that scale, is going to be a hard kind of choice of what to do practically in trying to become more conscious of these different paradigms, I guess. Do you have anything to say?
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's going to be difficult to let go of certain civilizational mistakes. My hope is that the love wisdom angle works for that too, or at least on some level. That if the culture really, really doesn't want to let go of something, it's probably because there's a good reason for it to be there. Even if it's wrong, either narratively or pragmatically, it could be wrong in all number of ways. But the harder it holds on and refuses to let go, the more we maybe want to say that we validate its perspective to some degree. That this is a principle I've talked about before. If you tell them that it is heroic, they'll feel validated and they'll relax a little and they'll say, thank you, that's so nice. And then if you turn it up and tell them that it is angelic, they might be like, okay, that seems a little much, but they'll be like, hey, that's very nice, you know. But if you turn it up again and you turn it up into, like, you say, this is the value of all values, this is God to which all other things should be sacrificed, wouldn't you agree that we should go as far as possible in this direction and let nothing stand in its way? And they'll say, that is too far. There are other considerations worth balancing against this thing I've been so stubborn about. And if we can get people out of their little snags in the dialectic with a little bit, like if you're in a snag like this, you don't just yank even harder. You don't need an even more devastating rebuttal to the wrong side of whatever hot button issue we're talking about. That's not going to solve the problem. It's counterintuitive, but you actually go in the opposite direction of where you want to go to loosen up and then get back in the other direction. And so the metamodern lubrication to the postmodern dialectic snags is we inflate all the perspectives, give them love, learn everything they have to teach us, and then hopefully take them a little so far that the other people even admit that they need to account for other things and they're going to be open to other values on these stubborn subjects.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Robert, Jeannie, and Paul.
So I have my psychologist hat on now, and one fact I want to share about why there's so little research on suicide. It's because it's such a rare event. It happens in less than 0.1% of the population, and it's so hard to get subjects for that to do research. Another area where there's been very little a rare event, very hard to get data on, has been in fires. It's a very infrequent event. The second thing I want to comment on is a conversation which psychologists have been excluded from. About 5 years ago, when we first had COVID and the Presidential Council was created, there was no psychologist, especially a social psychologist, put on the council because there was a great risk. What would happen if people wouldn't wear their masks? And the biggest trained person who could have helped with behavior change was a social psychologist. There's several very important things psychologists could have helped with, but have been excluded because decisions have become politicized.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Hunter, if you want to say something, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, we'll go to Jeannie.
Yeah, I'll just say that the politics is another big cause of the shadow. That what is, politically unpalatable, incorrect, or opposed to the interests of everybody involved will generally be under-investigated areas, which may well hold lots of ripe fruit to help us speed through the dialectic.
Thank you. Jeannie, followed by Paul.
I don't know if this is an example or an analogy, but I was working in the schools for a number of years. And every year or so, there would come down a new way to teach this subject. And I was like, how come we don't know how to teach this subject that, we've been doing this for so many years? But I came to enjoy it mainly because people get bored, especially kids. And if you have a new way to do it, even if it's not better, it's, more engaging. And for the teachers, it meant they had to, revise their methods and think about how they were doing it. So it engaged the teachers more. And I think in a way, rather than trying to get the perfect thing, another benefit was that each generation is learning this subject in a slightly different way. And then they are, when you get them all together, people are, well, I learned it this way, I learned it that way. There's more substance behind that in order to put it together. So I think, we really have to consider, the human characteristic of just getting bored. If we do it the same way, even if it's the perfect way, we can never find the perfect way because we're going to get bored of that.
Right, exactly. This is a big shadow, especially in the Western ethos. And in theory, the East has the solution, but the West and East just can't seem to talk to each other very effectively. The West is always very skeptical and insisting that everything be put in very clear terms. And the East is always insisting that the West is completely missing the point and not even trying to understand it properly or something. But in the West, when we make an intervention and we see that it works, we do this interpretive step where we say, therefore, this intervention causes this good thing or bad thing to happen. And if we had a lot of it, probably more of it would be happening. And I think, what about, this is a sort of a cybernetic analysis. It says something like, rewards often occur when hungers are fed and met. And so if there's something you've been failing to do for a long time, and you suddenly do it and it feels great, part of the reason it feels great is probably because it's been so long. And you don't want to come to the erroneous conclusion that if you do it over and over and over and over again, you're just going to feel great forever now because this thing causes great feelingness. It's like, that is not what science shows. And so this is another way that we have the shadow of science slowing down the dialectic, is that we have studies where we observe small effects or large effects, whatever. I knew of a study where they ran 40 different interventions on a workplace, and they all went wonderfully because it turned out that just trying anything new at all seemed to work really well. But if you'd only run one of those studies, then it would have been published with this headline, oh, this specific intervention causes positive effects. And that's another way that we get it wrong because we think, well, science is so authoritative. Science solved these medical problems and invented technology. And it's like, yes, but it has these reliable blind spots. And scientists could put together a laundry list of ways we can improve the scientific endeavor, but we're not well coordinated to do that. But that might be one of the most powerful things we could do to help humanity, like rocket ship through, like during NASA times, rocket ship through the problems, just devote our resources to the problem. That's worked before on really hard, complicated problems. And we just threw geniuses and money at it and it happened. And it's just let's just direct humanity's resources at its problems. And that's basically the whole goal of metamodernism.
Thank you. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you, Jeannie. So we're going to have two last people bringing up things, and then we'll wrap up. It's going to be Paul and then Mona. please take your time. We just want to not go too long.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
thanks,
Paul.
got it. Thanks. Good. I'm glad to know wow, it went fast because of such a great conversation. So I like to work with ideas like this from the point of view, because you're so in the real world when you talk about the metacrisis, how would you actualize it? And I think it's worthwhile just visualizing something together. So here's this global committee, United Nations times on steroids, with these beautiful meta-modernist people gathered, and what is the vision of what they do? I'll give you an example just to get our heads going. Oh, they are harnessing AI in the best possible way. So they can run a model in Burma. If we were to introduce Buddhism to this little section right now, in about 15 years, the projections of this AI that does a lot more than one mind can do says that's going to be beautiful. Meanwhile, if we take that little section of what's a coal producing state, Tennessee, Alabama, and we let them go, really the model says, let them produce coal things to the max, because we're also introducing Christianity, and in about 5 years, they'll both have economic prosperity, and they will choose another path. My point is, we have to be willing to hold our ideas so loosely and say that a given philosophy may need to be the perfect match at a given time, and it's beyond one brain to even know it. And that's one vision. But then you look at that, and that sounds so top down. Oh, we're just going to say, let's plant this seed, let's propagandize here. So I'm just raising sort of the conversation, that part of the conversation, to leave us thinking about. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like the visualization, and I'm not even immediately thinking of what would you do if you had all these. I guess in theory you would want to say something like, "Hey, everybody, like write down in like a paragraph your top contribution to the dialectic as far as you can tell. Like you think you've figured something out. You have a unique skill that will potentially allow you to detect insights that other people can't, or to provide them. Say what your unique thing is, and then an AI could be an interesting tool for this, but one way or another, we compare them, and then we group people and we say, okay, you five have a vaguely related thing. Like maybe it's vaguely related, like it's a kung fu master and a biologist. And it's like, is that related? And it's like, well, it's both about the body. So you five people go over there. And then over here, it's like economic stuff. And over here is politics. And over here is that. And we group people and they say, look, I'm not saying I'm Einstein, but like the one thing that I feel like I figured out, and then I wish humanity knew and would incorporate into its strategy is, and they'd share their thing. And then other people who'd been thinking in even vaguely related spaces would in many cases say, I can sort of cross from between our different modalities and get hints and whispers and inspiration from this incredible thing you've generated in such a different space from what I'm used to. And I'm seeing like deep correspondences that are opening up all kinds of creative avenues. And we're starting to see the mixing of the insights in this sort of almost alchemical or chemical dialectic process. So maybe that's what you would want to do. You'd want to get everybody to share their best insights and get in dialogues, and then see what new insights come after they've done that. And then they all compare the new insights, and then they do it again, and you iterate on that, and then who knows what happens.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mona. Mona, go ahead.
Thank you. Oh gosh, let's see if I can gather my thoughts. I wanted to comment on this aspect that I've heard you mention again and again, the integration of the shadow. And you seem to be talking about this like at a large scale, like as a matter of philosophy. But from what I know about it, this is, and you also prioritize speed versus being, accurate or flawless. So going there fast, and then you sort of hypothesize that the radical love and wisdom would be there to carry us through. But what I wanted to say from my own experience, because I can't speak to the whole world, is that inner work and integrating the shadow and coming to terms with all the failures that come along the way is a long process. You never go there like a rocket ship. And it's often, it's like winded, and then you kind of go in circles, and then you go again and again and again until you see it. And then I feel very, I don't know, scared when I hear we should get there fast, because I mean, you can get fast anywhere, like even over a cliff. So I'm a little bit concerned. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And it is kind of an intimidating or scary thing, even when it works. Speed all by itself is probably just dangerous, but in the right context, and I think the right context is something like love. And it needs to be love and speed, because if I think I'm onto something and I'm saying, oh, I'm not going to like check it carefully for errors, I'm just going to speed ahead, and I'm wrong, and I'm going to cause problems. And the farther I go, the worse the problems are going to get. Then the more sort of generally loving the environment is, the faster I'm going to register those problems, accept my mistake, and course correct. And so if you have that foundation of people being genuinely sensitive and responsive, then you can fall into these rushing patterns, because you know, like an electron whipping past a proton, that the farther out it goes, or like a planet going around a star, the farther out it goes, the more it's just going to eventually slow down and come back. And you can come away pretty far from the center, but as long as you have something like good faith, or something like a, quote, loving environment in which these things are occurring, there's a yeah, love does not coordinate with speed. I know there's a very, very difficult problem here. I mean, we could go into crazy territory with this. Like, there are whole ideas about like the divine marriage, for example, touching on themes like from the Platonic tradition of like truth, love, and beauty, that say things like truth is a one perspective. It's sort of our instinct to want to see what's really there. And beauty is another instinct. It's sort of our instinct to want to perceive the moment as feeling okay or good or very happy or peaceful. And these are contradictory in some sense, because sometimes the things that are really there don't make me happy, and the things that I want to feel are happy aren't really what are there. And so these two perspectives need to integrate. You could even, I don't want to get too overactive on the pattern matching here, but you could even map this onto the left and right hemispheres of the brain, perhaps, and say those need to integrate really well. And normally they integrate incrementally, because they have to check for errors. Because if they fall into each other, then it might turn out that one of them will stab the other in the back once it's opportune. And so how do you safely fall into each other and cross these differences in perspective? And maybe the answer is taking the Platonic idea that both truth and beauty in their perspectives must subordinate themselves to the mutual Schelling point that will allow for quick integration. In other words, the good. And so if truth is willing to make that deal of only getting what it wants insofar as it works for the common good with beauty, and beauty is willing to subordinate itself and say it will only get what it, even if it's right there and it could take it, like it won't if it's not for the common good with truth. And if both mutually orient to the same common target, goodness is the safest Schelling point to use to coordinate, to fall into each other, rapidly integrating, trusting that any mistakes that occur because of the environment of love will naturally self-correct. And if it's going to naturally self-correct, you might as well full speed ahead anyway. And that's how you get these really runaway effects that are not typical. They're not, I'm not saying It's not been the history of our culture so far, but I think the metamodern era is genuinely a very interesting time in the dialectic, where you can get these fast runaway spiral effects because you can establish awareness of common Schelling points and catalyze coordination at new layers of the human superorganism.
Excellent. So, Hunter, that was fantastic. This last piece was fantastic, and
Thank you.
great presentation. So Hunter is going to be back 2 weeks from now. So I just want to tell you a couple of things that are kind of connected to what we've talked about today. 1 week from now, we're going to be talking about the shadow as described by Carl Jung. It's going to be a full-fledged presentation of the concept of shadow, what it means, what's the root of it, and all of that. And Jung has a lot to say about that. Adrian is going to be doing the presentation. And then that's going to be on 24th. On 25th, we are actually bringing together two very different thinkers. One is Maria Montessori, who is a great innovator in education, and Christopher Alexander, who is an architect. And there is a lady who's an architect and a Montessori teacher, actually two of them, two separate people. One of them is going to present on how she has brought ideas of the architecture of Christopher Alexander in order to transform classrooms. And she's going to be interviewed by another lady who's an architect and runs a Montessori classroom. So it's going to be a really amazing conversation. So don't miss that. I've not announced it yet, but it's going to be on 52 Living Ideas on 25th, Saturday, next Saturday. So thank you very much, Hunter. I won't ask you right now what you want to do next, but I'm sure if you have some ideas, you're welcome to talk about it. But please.
I'll send a description later.
Sounds good. All right, folks. So thank you so much. And I really like the conversation. People come with their own views, own approaches, and, engage with each other. So that's just great. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.